So with that, let's get started. So of course, the importance of planning for college cannot be understated. This is a big, national problem. As of last year, we had over $1.8 trillion in student debt in the U.S. We have almost 44 million borrowers that have federal student loans, and there are of course some that have private loans as well. And the average balance per student is more than $40,000. Now, this is one of those times when the averages can really be deceiving. I happen to know quite a few people in their 30s, even late 30s. They're about to be promoted to partner in their law firm. Maybe law firm employees are in that situation, and they're still making, debt payments. So it's a big problem. And for those of you who want to support your children or grandchildren, perhaps this is one of the best ways to do that. In terms of our approach, we usually would focus on this as part of someone's comprehensive financial plan. Usually this comes out that way, and/or gifting strategy. At the same time, you can certainly address it on an issue-specific basis as well. And of course, the question is, well, what is the best way to save for college-related expenses? Now, not to jump to the conclusion, but that's essentially the idea of the seminar today, 529 college savings plans, they happen to be the most versatile tool to accomplish that goal. Of course, you can, pay for college out of pocket, right? Perhaps you can do it out of your brokerage account if you can afford to do so. But if you have time and if you do it in advance, there are many benefits of the 529 college savings plans. Flexibility, control, investment and tax benefits, some estate planning benefits as well. So we'll have a slide for each of those. We'll discuss it in detail. So in terms of the basics, so again, the 529 college savings plans are tax advantaged plans designed for you to save for college, for your children or grandchildren, or for yourself. By the way, you can use those plans for yourself. There's nothing wrong with that if you ever decide to go back to college. There are two types of plans out there. There are so-called prepaid plans, when you can essentially prepay for a certain number of credits or semesters for the student. I'll tell you, they're becoming less and less popular. And the reason that's the case is when you deal with younger beneficiaries, it's very hard to predict that they're going to go to a university, let's say in Maryland or Virginia. So usually for planning purposes, we focus on education savings plans, or they also call them investment plans. And that's going to be the focus of our seminar today. So in terms of the account options, all 50 states in the District of Columbia sponsor at least one type of 529 plan. In Maryland there's one, in DC there's one, in Virginia there are actually 4 of them. I asked Steve in terms of the residency of the attendees today, and he mentioned that most of you are from Maryland. So we'll focus on the Maryland options today. There are some similarities, a lot of similarities with other states, but there are also some differences. Now, most brokerage houses, Schwab, Fidelity, Merrill Lynch, they offer 529 plans. There are some potential issues with that approach, specifically in terms of the internal expenses. I tend to always point that out. With state-specific plans, essentially all of them, they have a board of trustees that oversees the plan, so they always negotiate on behalf of the investors, essentially. When you deal with brokerages, well, watch for those additional expenses. What are the benefits? Well, there are 2 types of benefits in terms of the tax benefits, I should say. There are upfront deductions on your contributions to the plan. The most important part here, your contribution has to be into your state-specific plan. So in Maryland, it would be tier price. That's important. Any fund that you contribute, any funds that you contribute into the account, grow tax-deferred and essentially tax-free as long as you use the funds for so-called qualified expenses. And we'll talk about what those are, and we'll also talk about what non-qualified expenses are. There are some estate planning benefits as well. We'll touch on that too, meaning transferring assets into the plan so that again, the next generation can benefit from that. There are some restrictions too in terms of the contributions, specifically your deductible contributions. So in Maryland, it's $2,500 per beneficiary per year. So you can contribute more than that. You just have to deduct those contributions over the future years. In terms of the withdrawals, as I mentioned earlier, again, they're designed for college-related expenses, and there are penalties if you take the funds out for other purposes. In terms of the investment options, even though I put it under the restrictions, I don't really necessarily think of it that way. It's just that most, specifically state-sponsored plans, they'll give you anywhere between 10 to maybe 20 choices. And I would say for most people, that's adequate for investment purposes. So we'll start with choices and timing here. We'll start with that piece. So in any 529 college savings plan, you'll have two types of choices. You'll have the so-called target date funds. So as an example, let's say Vanguard Target Date Fund 2045. That would be the name of the fund. And the assumption behind the strategy of this fund is that the beneficiary would presumably use the funds right around 2045. So when we work with young beneficiaries, newborns as an example, usually that's the approach we would take. We'd put them in the target date funds and keep it there up until they turn 13, maybe 14 years old. And that's when we consider switching, potentially, to so-called static investment options that don't change over time. This can be index funds, it can be actively managed funds, but the idea here is to essentially have more control in terms of how the funds are invested. Well, in some sense goes without saying, but just like with any investment account, if you need to use the money and the markets are down by 20 or 30%, chances are that's going to create an issue. So that's why, again, when someone turns 13, 14 years old, we want to review that. Now, in some sense, contrary to what I mentioned earlier, the state-specific plans are not always the best choice. And to give you an example of when perhaps that would not be the case is when you're thinking about making large lump sum or one-time contributions into the plan. Because again, once you start analyzing, once you start digging deeper, those internal expenses, even in a plan like tier price in Maryland, they can be rather high when compared to other plans. So as an example, if someone wants to make a larger contribution, let's say $100,000 plus, wants to pre-fund someone's education, the best choice as of today is actually the Utah plan. The Utah plan. And the reason that's the case is because it has the largest number of well-performing, low-cost investment options. And in terms of their administrative expenses, they're also the lowest in the nation. So that's just one piece. Now, what is the best time to contribute? Well, the best time to contribute is in anticipation of the child or grandchild. So this cute little baby, this is actually my son Nikolai. So, and that's me holding him when he was first born. He's 8 years old now. So how would you contribute for someone who's not even born yet? Well, you would create an account for yourself. You would make a contribution into the account. You'd invest it the same way you would normally do. And then once your child or grandchild is born, you would simply change the beneficiary. You would need that person's, of course, full name and social security number. It's just a form to complete. One of the questions I get every so often, well, should you contribute if your child or grandchild is already in college? So you don't necessarily have that much time for the funds to grow. Well, the answer is potentially, or it depends, because again, if you contribute into your state-specific plan, you still get that upfront deduction, you still get some tax-deferred growth, and again, all plans will allow you to invest in essentially a fixed income type of option that just essentially gives you 3 to 5% usually. So potentially, but certainly not as beneficial as if you're dealing with someone who's younger. Any questions at this point? Good. Okay, so in terms of the flexibility, in terms of the idea of having multiple plans in overall flexibility of the planning process, that is again one of the benefits here. One thing I want to emphasize, because this is a common misconception, is that the deductible contribution limits are per beneficiary in most states, including Maryland and Virginia, not in DC. In DC, it's actually $4,000 per single tax return or $8,000 per joint. So what happens is if you have multiple children or grandchildren, you can essentially fund all of those accounts and deduct your contributions in the same year. So as an example here, let's say we're working with grandparents that have 10 grandchildren and they want to support them all, and as part of the process they want to potentially reduce their taxable estate. Well, how can they possibly do that? They would open 20 accounts for each of those grandchildren, or 10 of them specifically. They would fund them $2,500 per beneficiary. That's the annual deductible amount. That gives you a one-time contribution of $50,000. Now, in terms of your tax deduction, right, it's 8%, anywhere between 6 to 8% in Maryland. I like to think, with my investment background, of it as an immediate rate of return, right? So if you make a contribution of $50,000 in this case, and you get a tax deduction on the Maryland side of 8%, that gives you an immediate rate of return of $4,000. So that's important. In terms of the additional tax benefits, this is more of a technical point. This is something of course, for you to understand, perhaps your CPA or your financial advisor. In each state, there are so-called carry-forward provisions, at least in most states that I know of. In Maryland, it's 10 years. And what that means, if you ever make a contribution above the annual deductible amount, you can actually deduct the remaining funds over the next 10 years. The biggest issue here is people forget to do so. So that is truly the biggest issue. So someone needs to create some kind of spreadsheet and keep track of it, or again, perhaps your CPA or financial advisor will do that for you. The carry forward is unlimited in Virginia, and it's only 5 years in DC. But again, we're focusing on Maryland today. So yeah, back to the estate planning benefits. There is this super funding provision that applies to the 529 plans, and essentially it allows you to front load your contributions into the plan. So a perfect example is, again, someone is talking about their legacy, they really want to support the next generation. How can they do that? Instead of course, contributing $2,500 per year, which is beneficial, they can do up to $90,000, again, per beneficiary. For a married couple, it would be $180,000. They would need to work with a qualified CPA who understands how it works, because you would actually need to file a gift tax return, and then each year you would have to do it. But once you make the election, it actually does not reduce your lifetime exemption. That's, again, one of the benefits of specifically of the 529 plans. Now, the bullet point here at the bottom comes up every so often. So in DC and Maryland, the maximum account value per beneficiary can be up to $500,000. I've never seen such a large account myself. I'm sure they exist. The largest account I've seen was right around $300K, which is what you would need for some of the top schools in the nation. In Virginia, it's $550,000.
Alex, could I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So I was really glad you talked about front loading, because years and years ago you could front load $55,000 and that kind of thing. Is there any downside to front loading? And you're the financial advisor here. Is there any downside of pumping all that money in at once? I know there's no downside as far as estate tax and that kind of thing. But is there a downside as far as dollar cost averaging or anything like that? Is it better to put in money over time, or is it better just to front load?
Yeah, so great question. Thanks, Steve. So again, the 529 college savings plans, they work exactly the same way as your normal investment account. So that approach would be the same. So let's say you made a contribution of $180,000 into the account. If you prefer to do so, if the beneficiary is very young, it's a newborn, let's say, chances are we'll just invest the funds all at once and let it fluctuate, let it do its thing, essentially. If someone is, again, older, let's say 13, 14 years old, You can always allocate a portion of the contribution into a bond fund or a fixed income fund, so you can protect it this way. But essentially, it works the same way as you would deal with a normal investment account. Yes, please.
If you do front load, do those dollars go out of your estate in terms of taxation?
2 years. So it's considered to be a completed gift as long as it's there for 2 years, it's out of your estate. Now, if with this particular, actually I take that back partially, if you die within the 5-year period, right, so the remaining funds would go back. So the assumption here is that you wouldn't die within the first 5 years of making the contribution. Yes?
Are there any limitations as to how frequently you can create a 529 for the same person? And my question on that is, create 529, kid goes to college, close, and then afterwards, X number of years afterwards, kid wants to go back to more college, one help of tuition, one option would be the one that 529. Is that possible, or is that prohibited?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can open a new account for anyone at any time. You don't even have to close it, as far as I know. Usually that's what people do when the account reaches zero balance, but you don't have to close it. Again, from that perspective, as I mentioned earlier, very much works like a typical investment account. So, and some of the platforms, not to get too technical here, they're just like a typical, investment platform, essentially. Any other questions on this? Okay. So, FAFSA, and this is one of those topics you can easily spend an hour talking about financial aid, which we will not do. We'll mostly focus on how, again, saving in your 529 plan potentially impacts your federal aid. So for the purposes of this example, let's say we're dealing with a $10,000 account. Well, if this account belongs to the student, potential reduction in financial aid, depending on other factors such as income as an example, can be as much as 20%. So relatively significant, $2,000 in this example. If the parent owns the asset, which is usually the case, potential reduction in financial aid is only 5.64%. So in this case, the reduction would be $564. That's the most common. Now, prior to the FAFSA Simplification Act of 2020, it was rather challenging to, when you start working with multiple generations, to include the grandparents' assets because they were considered to be third parties for the purposes of FAFSA, and they would reduce the potential federal aid by up to 50%. So what we used to do, again, when you talk with both sides essentially, the parents would fund the first 2 years, and then once you file your final FAFSA, that's when the grandparents would pay for the remaining education. That is no longer the case. Effective January of this year, they even refer to it as a grandparent loophole. Grandparents' accounts no longer count toward FAFSA. This is incredible. I first learned about this 4 or 5 months ago at this point. I've done some research. I talked to multiple people. As we speak today, that is one of those things. So what does that mean? Again, for any of you who are thinking about creating these plans for your grandchildren, it makes it even more beneficial for you to do so.
May I ask a question?
Please, yeah.
So if we're trying to maximize the tax benefits, a parent can maybe make a gift to the grandparents with the understanding that they would open up a 529 for their grandchildren, right?
Absolutely. See, it's amazing how that was not the case prior, as I mentioned earlier, but at this point, absolutely. $18,000 a year, that's easy. So distributions from the 529 plans. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there are 2 types. There are qualified distributions, and those are tax-free, and that's essentially what you want to plan for. In my experience, I really don't know that many people had enough money for non-qualified expenses. In most cases, it's really used for that purpose. Tuition, room and board, books, computers, there's actually a list of other items, but this is the most common. Now, there are certain expenses that do not qualify. Essentially, the list would be very long because It's everything besides the qualified expenses. So a car purchase is an example, so that would not qualify. College test prep, that would not qualify. If you find a tutor for the student, that would not qualify. College application fees. So sometimes people ask me these questions, but those are not qualified expenses. Now, in case, and there's going to be a separate slide when we talk about this more, in case you make those non-qualified expenses, there's a 10% penalty that applies on the growth portion only, and you have to pay taxes at your ordinary income tax rates on the growth portion only, and I'll talk about that separately. As part of the original Secure Act of 2019, you can now use up to $10,000 to repay student loans. That's the lifetime limit. So on the surface, it sounds like a good choice. I don't know pretty much anyone on the top of my head who would use this feature. Because the problem is if you have student debt, then chances are there was not much planning done ahead of time. But now we have this available. Under the TCJA, or the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, you can also use up to $10,000 per year to pay for K-12 private school tuition. Yes,
Is there an annual qualified expense limitation
for
for dollars? Say if you have $100,000 in a grandchild's account, can they use that $100,000 the first year if they go to college?
absolutely. No limitation. That's such a great question. No limitations whatsoever. As long as it's presumably for qualified expenses. If not, then you pay taxes and there's a penalty. So back to the fact that you can now use up to $10,000 a year to pay for K-12 private school tuition. That is a more beneficial feature. I'm personally not a big fan of it, and the reason that's the case is because the idea again behind the 529 college savings plans is to save for college, and you usually benefit from having more time. Now that said, though, if you do the planning and somehow, some way you realize that your child or grandchild is going to have a scholarship, and you will no longer need the funds you already saved in your 529 plan, well, again, that gives you that additional flexibility. It's not a very commonly used feature. Okay, so control of the 529 plan. This looks like a short slide. In my opinion, that is perhaps one of the primary reasons why grandparents decide to take this approach. And again, I'll give you a little bit of a background behind it. Usually when you work with parents that want to save for their children's education, it's a pretty straightforward conversation. 2 daughters, 3 and 5, how much do we need to save to pre-fund their college, presumably, by the time they go to college? It's very different with grandparents. Usually right around the holiday season, maybe third, maybe fourth quarter, you start having that conversation. They want to make gifts to their loved ones, to their children, to their grandchildren. Every so often they want to make larger gifts, thousands of dollars, perhaps tens of thousands. Now one of the issues they have is, let's say they give the money to their parents. There's no certainty whatsoever that the parents are actually going to use the money for the benefit of the grandchild. And I'm not trying to generalize too much here, but you tend to have that conversation. If they gift appreciated stock, same issue, right? Even though that can be held in their account. With the 529 plan, this is truly a gift with a predetermined purpose. Why is that? Well, as the account owner, you retain full control over the account. Full control over the account. In terms of the investment choices, in terms of the distributions, in terms of the timing, you can always change the beneficiary. If you have multiple, again, grandchildren, and one of them is no longer doing what you want them to be doing, you can always change the beneficiary that way. The beneficiary has no direct access to the funds. In fact, you don't have to even share it with them. You can mention that, start saving some for your education. You don't have to provide any amounts to them unless you want to. Now, this is again one of those things usually when you start working with both sides of the family. I usually suggest that there's some planning in place so that people don't overfund those accounts. But at least technically speaking, again, you don't have to share. So again, the bottom line is, when you start talking about those options, sometimes the fact that you fully control the money really makes it, the reason why people establish them to begin with. Okay, so let's say you're lucky, that's perhaps the best way to describe it, and you actually overfunded your 529 plans. What are your options? Well, you used to have 3 options, now you have 4 options. You can take a non-qualified distribution. And as I mentioned earlier, you would have to pay ordinary income taxes on the growth portion only, plus there's going to be a 10% penalty. So if you invested $10,000 in the account, it increased in value to $12,000, only $2,000 would be taxable to you. Now, what happens if the current balance is less than the amount that you contributed? I actually had a couple of experiences like that. Well, there's no taxes to pay, right? You contributed $10,000, the balance is now at $9,000. You take a full distribution, there's no growth, so there's also no penalty. It's a rare situation, but it actually happened. You can change the beneficiary to a qualifying family member. That is perhaps the most common approach. It doesn't have to be a blood relative, but it has to be a relative up to your second cousin. So a lot of different choices. There's actually a list of potential family members. If the account, you can change the account ownership to the child or grandchild. And presumably you'd want to do that if they're in a lower tax bracket. So then they can take a non-qualified distribution and use the funds, as an example, to buy a car or to make a down payment.
May I ask a question?
Please.
So assume a parent has a 529 plan for a child.
Yeah.
The parent is the owner, and he or she dies. Who then becomes the owner of that plan, and how would that be accomplished?
Yeah, so every account application that I know of, certainly in Maryland, will have a successor owner section on the application. So for married couples, usually it's the surviving spouse, same thing for the grandparents. So once that happens, again, the successor owner is in control.
So as long as those beneficiary designations have been completed, the 529 plan would not become a probate asset.
That is correct. Correct, yes. So this is, don't quote me on that. So the last time we completed this application for someone online, it wouldn't go through until you select a successor owner. So if you do it on paper, they will most likely process it as is without the successor owner. When you do the online application, it's one of the sections with an asterisk, so you have to complete it. Yeah, that's right, for Maryland. Okay, so the final point here is actually very interesting. It creates a lot of interesting opportunities. I don't think anyone implemented them yet because this just became active essentially in January of this year. So under the Secure Act 2.0, you can now, or the beneficiary can now convert up to $35,000 into his or her own Roth IRA out of the 529 plan. Again, we're trying to address the issue of overfunding your accounts. Now, there are some rules that are in place. The first one is perhaps the most challenging one to keep track of, as I'm thinking about it, is the fact that the account needs to be in place for at least 15 years. Right? So again, as you start thinking about it, you funded this account when someone was 2 years old. Right now they're 17, 18 years old. Perhaps you don't no longer need the money for any reason. You can start doing the conversions into this person's Roth IRA. Now, when that happens, at least under today's rules, it's limited to the annual Roth IRA limit. So for those under the age of 50, it's $7,000 per year. So this would have to be done gradually, and only the beneficiary can do this. So not the account owner.
Does the beneficiary have to have earned income to do the Roth designation?
See, that's another one. It's interesting. At first, when I first heard about it, I was like, wow, this is amazing. But that's one of the issues. You have to have earned income to do the conversion. It's possible that they'll modify it. Because again, I really do not believe anyone implemented the strategy yet. You can just start planning for it. But still, again, what they're really trying to address is this concern typically some people have, of overfunding their 529.